Hello out there, everyone. Thanks for tuning in for another edition of National Museum of Industrial History's virtual museum programs. We are so happy to be joined once again by Martha Capwell Fox from the National Canal Museum and D&L National Heritage Corridor. There's a lot going on in the world and in our communities today, so in the interest of respecting that, I'm going to keep my comments brief. But if anyone would like to check out how to help NMIH right now, or future programs that we have going on, we invite you to please check out nmih.org. Martha, who again is joining us once again, we're so happy to have her, is a professional writer and editor. She's worked in magazine publishing at National Geographic and Rodale, and she's the author of 7 books, including her most recent one, which she presented on, I think, 2 weeks or so ago. If you haven't checked out that talk or her book, we definitely encourage you to do so. If you have any interest in the Lehigh Valley and why we're here, or the history of the area, is a fantastic look about our history, our heritage, and why our area is the way it is. Martha is a graduate of American University with a dual degree in international relations and U.S. history. And if you guys have any questions throughout the talk while Martha's presenting, we ask you to leave them in the comments, and we'll do our best to get to them and answer them at the end of the talk. And without any further delay, I'll pass it over to you, Martha. Thanks for joining us.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm really grateful to NMIH for asking me to come in and give this talk because the silk subject is very dear to my heart since I actually grew up in the business. My father worked in the silk industry from before I was born, eventually going into business for himself. And he was, in fact, the last silk weaver in the city of Allentown, which was once, as you'll hear in a couple minutes, one of the major centers of silk production in the United States. And this is an industry that a lot of people don't really realize how dominant it was, particularly in this area, throughout at least the first 2/3 or so of the 20th century. So, gotta find there we go. All right. So as I said, this is a subject that is very close to my heart because of growing up in it. And I have been talking about this for quite some time. In fact, the first major project that I did on the silk industry was for the D&L all the way back in about 2001, when they asked me to put together a list of all of the places in the corridor where there were silk mills. Nobody, including me, had any idea of exactly how large of a project this was going to turn out to be. And I can't really even give you a hard and fast number of how many mills there were. But suffice it to say, this area that is shown on the map right now, and for those of you who are not that familiar with the D&L corridor, it comprises the counties of Bucks, Northampton, Lehigh, Carbon, and Luzerne. Now you can see that this map shows a considerably larger part of eastern Pennsylvania. About 1913 until 1930, this, believe it or not, was the largest producing area, the largest producer of silk goods anywhere in the world. And the United States was, at that point, the largest producer of silk goods anywhere in the world. There was all sorts of silk production, ranging from weaving to knitting to making specialty projects. And at various times, although it's a little hard to compare employment statistics from one industry to another in Pennsylvania, but it's extremely possible that the employment in the silk industry rivaled, if not exceeded, the employment in steel and possibly even in coal mining, counting anthracite and bituminous coal in Pennsylvania. So it was an enormous industry in this Commonwealth. And as you can see from this map, all sorts of just little places. I mean, Veracruz is popping up there. Catasauqua, which is where I live, actually had 3 mills. Tiny little places had enormous mills like Weatherly. and which we'll see a couple pictures of later. So it was just a massive employer. And it all came about because the very first center of silk production in the United States was actually around Paterson, New Jersey, and that began in the years before the Civil War. It was originally a business that was both owned and staffed mostly by immigrant British men who had been moved out of the industry in Britain because of all sorts of situations which pretty much crippled the silk industry there. And when it began to be more common in the United States, starting in about between 1840 and 1850 in Paterson and in Connecticut, many skilled silk men, both weavers and businessmen, emigrated to the United States. Well, by about the 1880s or 1890s, the entire pattern of immigration into the United States changed quite a great deal, and a tremendous number of Eastern European immigrants came into the country. Many of them actually also had experience in the silk and other textile industries in Europe. And they arrived at the same time that there were some sudden advances in textile machinery technology, which made it possible for less skilled people to work a lot of the machinery, where working in a silk mill had pretty much been almost an artisan occupation. It suddenly became possible for very young, unfortunately, in a lot of cases, and pretty much unskilled people to take over those jobs. Well, the combination of the less skill requirements, the arrival of the foreign immigrants, many of whom also had socialist tendencies, and they were not as likely to just simply accept the working conditions, and they began to have labor issues in Paterson as well. The combination of all of that led the silk makers in Paterson to start looking for some place where there would be a cheaper source of labor. And the very first place that they noticed was the coal regions of Eastern Pennsylvania, because one of the things that was essential to the silk business in Paterson was a ready supply of nice, clean burning, hot burning anthracite coal, because anthracite was the ideal fuel for using to power the steam engines that powered the machinery in those mills, because it didn't make soot or ashes. And so keeping a mill clean was always a huge preoccupation. So there, sitting in the coal regions of Pennsylvania, was not only a ready supply of good fuel, a ready supply of naturally soft water, which is another thing that was really important for the processing of raw silk yarn, but also a very large population of young, semi-educated, and probably pretty docile female labor. As a matter of fact, the silk industry was the first one that rose up in Pennsylvania because of its human resources, and less so because of its natural resources. That population of young females were the daughters, sisters, and often wives of workers in the coal mines and on the railroads. And up until that point, there had been very, very few employment opportunities for women. And so the coming of what was originally silk processing mills, known as throwing mills, first arrived in the coal regions for the most part, beginning in the 1880s and 1890s. And at the same time, however, with the collapse of pretty much of the anthracite iron industry in the Lehigh Valley, particularly in Bethlehem and in Allentown, as the iron and steel business began to shift largely to Western Pennsylvania, Allentown in particular, and some other cities, worked very hard to attract silk mills from the Paterson owners by a combination that sounds real familiar to us nowadays of tax incentives and transportation links being built at taxpayer expense and all that sort of thing. And so one of the very first mills, actually a very large silk mill that came to Lehigh Valley, was the Phoenix Company. Now, anybody that's been on the lower part of Hamilton Street in Allentown has probably seen the enormous red brick building that stretches between Hamilton and Linden Streets down at the bottom of the hill. The little bus station is alongside it now, and it has long since stopped being a silk mill. But the Phoenix Manufacturing Company, silk manufacturing company from Patterson, added, they didn't shut down in Patterson. They opened a mill in Allentown in 1881. It still says Adelaide Mill on the top of the building because that was, Adelaide was the name of the president of the company. And it became an enormous, enormous silk mill, which then went on to house several other textile type industries until the entire business pretty much went out of the Lehigh Valley. But as you can see, just with this ad, what they were manufacturing was an enormous variety of silk goods. So little by little, before the beginning of the 20th century, some fairly large mills were established in the Lehigh Valley. This is another building that is largely still standing, although it suffered a pretty nasty fire about 15 or 18 years ago. Bethlehem Silk Mill. Again, this was partially what was known as a throwing plant, a throaster, as you can see in the ad there, which meant that this was a mill where they processed raw silk yarn. But it very rapidly became a full service, if you will, an integrated steel mill. Sorry, steel mill is sort of on my mind there too. Silk mill, like the steel mill across the way, where the raw goods came in one side, were processed, which in the case of silk is largely a matter of lots of washing and twisting and washing some more and twisting in another direction and then spinning multiple filaments of silk together. And in short, what it is the preparation of raw silk into a form where it can be turned into a beautiful piece of cloth or a useful product, like for instance, the covering on electrical wires, which was a very common use of silk in the 20th century, and all sorts of other things as well, even rope and decorative braids and upholstery material and all sorts of things. And Bethlehem Silk made all of that sort of stuff too. And so this was one of the mills that was really a start to finish silk production business. And this place employed almost 3,000 people at its height. And that was not unusual. It was pretty much the same at the Adelaide as well. And with these businesses, once they were established in the 1890s, they pretty much continued as successful businesses until the 1950s. This is one of the sort of outliers in a way. Stroudsburg was not a major a silk producing area, but there was a throwing mill also there. And actually one of the last mills to stay into business was a ribbon mill that was still in business in the early 21st century up in Stroudsburg. The next couple of pictures here are a series that were shot in the Bayer Silk Mill in Lehighton. And again, this is a throwing mill, a processing mill of raw silk. So what you can see here are bundles of silk that have already been partially processed, and they are put into what are called skeins. So this is no longer really raw silk, but it has been washed and twisted to a certain point. And what these women are doing is feeding the skeins again through another sort of finishing machine. It was probably pretty hot work. And obviously they are on their feet with no apparent place to sit down. But on the other hand, you can also see in this picture the emphasis that most mills had on cleanliness, because you didn't want to get this very, very expensive yarn dirty to the point where it either had to be cleaned, which caused delays and could even stop production altogether, or it might even ruin the quality of the silk. And silk yarn was always very, very expensive. That's because there never was a domestic production of raw silk. It was tried multiple times, as a matter of fact. And in fact, Bethlehem was one of the first places that a cocoonery was actually established in the United States. Bishop Etwine arranged to have silkworms brought from France and the suitable type of mulberry trees planted to feed them. And the Moravian economy had a small production of silk yarn. Never amounted to anything that could be used or sold to any market larger than the Moravian community in Bethlehem. But as it turned out, there actually was even an economic bubble with an attempt to create a domestic silk industry that actually began in the late 1820s. With another thing that is a familiar story to us now, and that was an imbalance of trade. The Treasury Department in the late 1820s became concerned at the amount of money that well-to-do Americans were sending abroad in order to buy really fine silk garments or just plain silk yardage from places like France and Italy and Britain. And so the Secretary of the Treasury at the time determined to encourage the development of a domestic silk growing industry. And so what happened in New England in particular, and also to a certain extent in the Middle Atlantic states, was that many farms actually turned over all of their arable land to cultivating mulberry trees of a particular kind. Now, this was all right for a while because the mulberry trees in question were being imported at a pretty cheap price from Italy and southern France, which is where this particular type of white mulberry that silkworms prefer as their food was grown. And it started out rather cheaply, and it also became a sort of genteel occupation for women to raise silkworms. And people would turn rooms of their houses into cocooneries. But problem was that it then turned into sort of a craze, and this was also hamstrung by two problems. One was the amount of time that it took for mulberry trees to reach an age and a stage of development where they could be pretty much stripped of their leaves and still survive, which was a little problematic, particularly in winter in New England. And the other thing was that as the demand for the mulberry trees grew, it became extremely expensive to buy the seedlings. And so people invested crazy amounts of money, sometimes even mortgaging their farmland in an attempt to jump on this particular craze. And although there was some domestic silk produced out of all of this in the 1830s, that was of pretty good quality, apparently. The problem was that there wasn't any machinery or any know-how in the United States for taking that raw silk and turning it into the beautiful fabric that people were willing to pay lots of money for. So that was already a pretty good dent in that business. And then the whole thing became moot when a blight swept through the mulberry trees in New England and the Middle Atlantic states and wiped them out completely. The mulberries that we see now are not those mulberry trees. And that was the end of that. And so domestic silk production has just never actually taken off in this country. But it still did leave an interest in developing a silk industry, and that was how it eventually took root in both Connecticut, near the area around the Connecticut River, and in Paterson. So, back to Lehighton here. This is, as you can see, the throwing mill. This is Bayer in Lehighton. They had a couple of mills in Carbon County. And here is another picture. This is of what amounts to their laboratory, because silk needs to meet certain standards for tensile strength, for dyeability, et cetera. And also, because it was so expensive, it was constantly weighed and measured so that the mill owner knew that the money that he had paid for this quantity of raw silk was in fact what he got. So this is actually a testing laboratory, also in the Bear factory. And again, you can see, even though maybe they kind of cleaned it up for the photographer, that this was always a very tidy and clean place because you didn't want to contaminate the silk. This photograph is actually in the largest throwing plant in the world at the time. This is Reed and Lovett in Weatherly, Pennsylvania. Another one of those stories of a municipality that just threw everything they possibly had into attracting a business. Weatherly had some capacity as a repair center for the Lehigh Valley Railroad, but nevertheless, it was still a tiny town in Carbon County, and had a population. When the Reed and Lovett Company announced their intention to expand their operation from Paterson into Pennsylvania, it kicked off an enormous competition among towns in Carbon and Luzerne and Lackawanna counties in particular to attract this large and successful company. And Weatherly won. They won by giving them several years worth of tax-free living. They convinced the Lehigh Valley Railroad to build a spur, another spur into the town, and they constructed a 9,000 square foot brick building, which unfortunately is no longer standing. And this is a picture that was taken in the early 20th century, and you can just see row upon row upon row of machinery here. And what these machines did was twist multiple already twisted lengths of yarn from one bobbin into a thicker set of yarn that could be used for certain purposes. Depending on what your end product was, you had to know from the very beginning what you were going to do with the silk that you had just bought and had transported at fairly great expense all the way across the Pacific from China and Japan, and then all the way across the United States. So it was always a sort of just-in-time business in silk, and everything had to be very, very carefully calculated. But it did really get established partly because the first people who moved the industry into Pennsylvania already had a tremendous amount of experience and expertise in the industry, and that coupled with the cheap labor and the excellent transportation network that got the finished products to market in the rest of the country were what combined to make this really, really successful. This is another interior picture of the Simone Mill. Now this is a complex in Easton that is still standing and has become pretty much of a success story in the city of Easton for being reclaimed and put to other uses. A lot of it is no longer standing, but quite a great deal of it still is. In its heyday, Simone had over 1 million square feet of silk plant under roof. And you can see that this was one of the ways that they powered the entire plant. I don't believe this building is still standing, but it had an enormous capacity to produce all sorts of goods, and was another place that also actually employed several thousand people at a point when Easton's population was probably only a little over 15 or 16,000. Here's a look at the entire complex here. The Simone brothers, who were also from New Jersey and ran a mill that was also in Paterson, were known as very benevolent employers. Of course, they were all opposed to unionization in the late 19th and early 20th century, but nevertheless were known as very benevolent employers in terms of having facilities to care for people if they were injured or sick, a program for supporting families, making sure that children had clothing and shoes and had adequate access to schooling and things like that. And then Herman Simone actually left a fair endowment to the city of Easton. But as you can see, this was an enormous complex. And this was all entirely devoted to silk manufacture. The Simone was also another place where raw silk came in one end and finished goods came out the other. And they too made an enormous variety of stuff, including ribbons. They also, when the automobile industry took off, became one of the leading producers of silk plush, which was widely used for upholstery in cars, because although silk has a reputation for being delicate, it's actually quite strong and hard wearing. And so it was a very good material for using in cars. Here we go, as they say, lining silks, tie silks, velvet, plushes, famous for their black ribbons, apparently. D.G. Dairy, several of whose mills are still standing around the Lehigh Valley, was the largest individual silk company owner in the world until his business failed in the 1920s. But Dairy, who was an Austrian veteran of the army of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, learned the silk weaving trade in Hungary, which was really what he was a native of. And he came to Paterson in the 1890s, ran a mill there for about a year, and then jumped on the wave of expanding of the silk industry in the rest of in the Lehigh Valley. So as you can see, he established mills in a lot of places, most of them in eastern Pennsylvania. The Taunton, Massachusetts one was kind of the outlier there. And you may be familiar with the stories about his enormous house in Catoir, which is unfortunately sitting empty right now. That was once one of the great show places of anywhere in the Lehigh Valley. It housed his art collection. It has a ballroom, a cocktail lounge, totally lined in imported stained glass and Moravian tile, an indoor swimming pool that's larger than many people's houses. It's just a phenomenal property. And Dairy also was pretty philanthropic. He was the person who propelled Catasauqua's bond buying issues in World War I up into the literal tens of millions of dollars. And this was how Catasauqua became nationally known as the $1 million town, because of the amount of money that Dairy and the other silk manufacturers and the other industrialists put into the Liberty bonds during World War I. Sacquoit, another area that some folks might be familiar with from the time when the area was the site of the large concerts at Music Fest, the ones on the island there, a little upstream from the Hill to Hill Bridge. The Sacquoit Mill was along the canal and was also an extension of Paterson Companies. They made all sorts of insulating silks. As you can see there, an insulating silk is what was put on things like electrical wires and stuff like that. But they all made a whole variety and were pretty nimble at changing what they could apply, what they could supply, depending on the demands of the market. Just a brief look at the listing for just South Bethlehem and all of the mills that were just scattered in just that one particular area of Bethlehem. Now, we'll have a look at the last mill in Allentown, which was the one that my father ran. It was known as Catoir Silk Company, and it was located at 918 North Lumber Street in Allentown. It was originally a silk mill. It had been run by a man who moved from the Adelaide building into this smaller mill as the industry began to contract in the 1950s. And it wasn't sort of the classic looking mill with the pointed skylights. It was just a solid brick building and with very large windows. And as you'll see from the remaining pictures here from the mill itself, by the time that it was my father's in the 1970s and 1980s, the bulk of the staff were older people, most of whom had worked their entire adult lives in the silk mills. They just went from mill to mill as they closed down. And in a lot of cases, they were women who just simply enjoyed what they did, enjoyed the camaraderie of the folks that they worked with, and basically enjoyed working in the mills. So this lady, Anna Osika, was one of the two winders. And what Anna is doing in this picture is taking a skein of yarn and putting it onto the round wire mechanism that you can see down on the lower part of the picture behind her, known as a swift. And then that filament was run up through a porcelain-lined eye and attached to the bobbins at the top of the frame. And the bobbins moved back and forth so that as the yarn unreeled off the swift, so that the bobbin became evenly filled. We do have a video of the operation of my father's mill, but unfortunately, being working from home, I did not have access to it because it is in the archives at the National Canal Museum. So we'll have to go with the still pictures, which were taken in about 1982 by Ken Bloom, who was a Time Life photographer before he and his wife relocated to Allentown in 1980. So we'll have a look at a few more of the pictures of people working. Again, here is Anna with a good look at actually her winding reel. There were 4 of these altogether. They were about 25 feet long, so 50 feet altogether on each machine. And both she and the other lady who was the winder, Mrs. Hassler from Catasauqua, went back and forth, up and down, keeping an eye on those bobbins and those skeins, making sure that they got as much as possible onto every one of the bobbins because it had to be run continuously. Now, if it did break, there was a tiny, tiny knot that everybody who worked in the silk mill knew how to make, and they could actually attach a broken end to a fresh end and keep it going. And that knot was so tiny that at the very end of the production cycle, when the finishers would go over the woven goods, a lot of times they couldn't even find those knots, and they didn't interfere at all with the fine, smooth finish of the finished goods. This is the creel here on the left that fed everything into the warp. Now, warping is probably the most technically demanding job in the mill. And that was my dad there on the right, Louis Capwell, and Catherine McQuillan, his warper. Catherine spent her entire adult life as a warper, and she was very, very good. What she's doing here is creating the very large bobbin that is put into the back of the loom, and then it is fed through the loom, through all of the various wires and guides, and then that is what's woven. The warp is the sort of foundation of anything that is woven, and what goes in the shuttle and goes back and forth is known as the fill or the weft, as the case may be, if you're going to be technical about it. But this creel that you can see, you can't even see all of it, held about 1,000 bobbins. And it was, as I say, a very painstaking job. And here is Catherine making sure that everything is running smoothly through one of the 2 or 3 reeds that every one of the ends of this yarn had to be fed through before it was wound onto the great big Ferris wheel shaped warping machine, and then onto the large warp bobbin. Another image, Ken getting a little arty on this one. We're very fortunate to have these because not only from a standpoint of my family's heritage, but the fact that there are virtually no photographs of people actually working in silk mills. There are vintage pictures of people standing stiff with their arms folded alongside non-functioning machinery, and but very few of people actually working. And there's a funny story attached to this too, because when Ken came and asked my father for permission to photograph in the mill, my father talked about it with the staff, but Ken asked him, and they were okay with it, but Ken asked my dad not to let them know when he was coming. And Dad thought that was a little bit unfair. Ken, being very, very experienced, was obviously incredibly capable of just fading into the background when he was taking most of these pictures. They forgot he was there by the end of the first day. But on the first day that Ken came, all the ladies had had their hair done. So they were a little self-conscious at first, but it faded. This lady here in front, Irene Klauser, from Northampton, was at this point probably about 80. And she was getting ready to carry bobbins from the doubler, which is the machine on the left that you can't really see very well, upstairs, up a flight of wooden steps. The only elevator was for hoisting really heavy stuff. There was no other elevator for people in the building. And Irene went up and down those steps probably 20 or 30 times a day, which is probably why she lived to be 100. So that was pretty much Irene's job, was to keep an eye on the doubler, which didn't run quite as fast as the winders did, and to carry finished bobbins up to the weaving floor on the second floor. The weavers actually included a certain group of men. There were, I think, 4 of them out of the 9 weavers that my father had, and this is John Thomas. My father's looms dated from the 1920s and 30s, and they were completely mechanical. What you can see there on the left is the pattern card, which is really pretty much of an early computer, because the pattern that the loom would weave was first worked into those punch cards. And then that controlled a lot of the rise and fall of a lot of the machinery, and that was what produced the pattern. So weaving was a very skilled job. Weaving and warping were very, very skilled jobs. And one of the things that made the industry difficult to maintain and ultimately ended it was the loss of skilled people who knew how to do these jobs. This is Mary Stupitz, who was probably at this point only in her late 50s or early 60s. She was the youngest of the weavers, and she was the last one who was there. Mary was from a part of Austria called Burgenland, and my father always maintained that the best weavers in the world came from that part of Austria, and there were lots and lots of them in the Lehigh Valley in the early and mid 20th century. Another sort of artsy look, but you can see the woven goods on the front of each loom. Each one of the weavers worked between 4 and 6 looms every day. So there again, too, that was a very demanding job physically and also mentally, because the looms were not super fast, but they could work fast enough that if there was a mistake of some sort happening or something was breaking, it wouldn't take long for it to produce a couple inches of something that had a problem, and that would be a big problem. Loom fixers, also absolutely important for the maintenance and the smooth running of the mill. Also an amazingly skilled job. This skill is, for all intents and purposes, completely lost. Another thing that made it very difficult for my father to carry on was that both of the loom fixers were in their 80s, and both died unexpectedly. And so that made for a more difficulty. His mill manager was a good mechanic as well, but it was really difficult for him to maintain 36 looms as well as the rest of the machinery in the building, and also to just make sure that things kept running smoothly. So that became a really huge challenge, just to keep the machinery going. The finishing that I mentioned was so painstaking that, as you can see, it actually took 3 people to keep ahead of the yardage that was being produced at the mill. What we've got here in front of us, too, is something that most people don't realize, is that the upscale menswear company, Countess Mara, had all of their necktie silk produced in the Lehigh Valley, most of it by my father, and that's what all 3 of these folks are working on. And the young man in the plaid shirt was the one exception to the age average, because Kerry was only probably in his 20s at that point, where everybody was close to or well past regular retirement age. Again, as you can see, a a standing job all the way. And so I'm sorry I don't have the video to show everyone, but hopefully I'll be able to come out and do this live so that everyone can see exactly what a day in the mill was like. It is an edited version that we used in the exhibit on the silk industry in the Canal Museum in 2002, but it actually is an edited down part of a video that actually my brother shot in the mill in the late 80s that's about 70 minutes long. And that's a little too long to sit through, actually. But I'd be glad to, answer any questions anyone has. And hopefully we will be able to take this show out live and show all of the more pictures, and there are more pictures from the Ken Bloom series, and also to show the video.
I hope so that we can do soon too.
Yes, yes. As an NMIH, I have not been able to do the complete thing twice now. So I have to, when the museum is ready, or when the Canal Museum has the capacity to do this as well, we will definitely.
Third time's going to be a charm, right?
Put on the full show. And just I will end by saying that this is really a fascinating story, and this is just sort of the high points. The stories of the people who worked in these mills, and we didn't even touch on the earlier part of the industry here in Pennsylvania in particular, and so there are a lot of aspects to it, but just simply the story that this became the first and most important industrial employer of women, and actually led to a lot of labor issue awareness among women, not only in the silk industry, but other textile industries, and then in the needle trades. It's just a whole big story of a big chunk of the industrial history story in Pennsylvania that really has not been fully addressed. So hopefully I can get back to this topic sometime, and because it's definitely a valid story, both for the Heritage Corridor and the Industrial Museum, which, by the way, has a wonderful silk exhibit.
Thank you. Yeah, if anybody hasn't been in the museum, we have an entire, textile exhibit that, has looms and warpers and winders, and, it goes into some of the stories. So if you haven't been in the museum and you're interested in the topic, we do have a nice exhibit. So thank you for mentioning that. Looking at some of the comments, a lot of people are saying hi, Martha. Someone asked if if the mulberry trees that are common in Bethlehem might have been part of the Bishop Etwine experiment.
That's a good question, but probably not. For the reason that Etwine started to do this in the late 18th century, in like the 1790s, and I guess it's remotely possible. I certainly don't know much about trees and their long-term survival and how they can hand down multiple generations. But when you consider how much change there has been in the area that was once Moravian Bethlehem, I think it's probably unlikely. Sure. And apparently also the particular strain of mulberry that I mentioned, that white mulberry, just does not do well in our climate. So that was a big problem.
Interesting. Somebody else commented that they've read articles that Kutztown had thrown some extravagant parties and events for a week trying to get dairy to open silk mills in their community at one point.
I would love to see that if there is some sort of printed documentation. That would not surprise me at all. And
that makes sense, right?
Yes, it does. It does. And there ultimately was a dairy mill in Kutztown. So I think that probably is a known phenomena, because all sorts of towns were attempting to attract not just the silk business, obviously, but industry in general. So yeah, I'd love to see if there's any documentation about that.
Me too.
Yeah.
I think that was mainly the questions that we had. So I just want to end and, thank you again for joining us and, not only sharing that great part of Lehigh Valley history, but, your family history as well. It's, always great to hear someone that has some firsthand experience in these things too. So
Yes.
very appreciative of that.
Yeah, I may very well be one of the last people who worked in a silk mill in the Lehigh Valley, because
Could be.
I spent a year working for my father between Geographic and Rodale. So
Interesting.
yeah,
I didn't know that.
yes, yeah.
All
Sometimes
right.
I forget.
Martha, thanks again. We always love having you speak either virtually or in person, which we hope to be able to do again soon. Again, for those of you who tuned in a little late, please check out Martha's books. She has a lot of great history about the Lehigh Valley and, also nationally. She has some publications as well. So go ahead.
Actually, if I can put in one plug for
Please
the
do.
archives at my place, in 2002, I did finish up the DNL project by presenting a paper at the Canal Symposium. And so if anyone is interested in seeing a copy of that, if they email me at archives@delawareandlehigh.org, I will be glad to get them a copy of the paper.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, thanks for joining us and have a good afternoon, everyone out there watching.
Thank you.
See you soon.